There's a question no one asks when the body starts to fail. Not what do I have? Not what medication will I take? The question that rarely comes to mind is the only one that truly matters. What am I putting into my body every single day that is destroying what's left? Because here is something most people never discovered. The human body does not deteriorate by accident. It deteriorates in an organized, systematic, and silent way. And this process has a name. That name is chronic inflammation. And the most disturbing thing of all is that it doesn't hurt. It has no color, no smell. It simply acts. Slowly, every day, while you sleep, work, laugh, eat. Think now about a few things that seem unrelated to one another. The joint pain that appeared out of nowhere. The feeling that the brain is slower than it should be. The fatigue that doesn't go away even after a good night's sleep. The weight that won't budge no matter what you do. This is not aging. This is inflammation. And now comes the part most people never knew. There's a nutritional protocol used by some of the most elite combat units in the world, developed, in part, to keep the body functioning at peak performance. Not for weeks, but for decades. We are not talking about a diet. We're talking about physiological strategy. And in this video, you will learn the 14 foods at the center of that strategy. Not because they are exotic, but precisely because they are simple, and that is exactly what makes them so powerful. Before we continue, if you made it this far, it's because this kind of knowledge matters to you. And this is exactly the type of content we publish here. No sensationalism, no miraculous recipes, just what science and high-performance protocols have to say about the human body. If that resonates with you, click subscribe now and turn on the notification bell. Not to help us, so that the next video reaches you, because it might be exactly what someone close to you needs to see. With that said, let's get to what matters. Before we get into the foods, you need to understand what is happening inside your body. Because without that foundation, everything else loses meaning. Inflammation, in its original form, is a survival tool. When you get injured, the immune system sends cells to the affected area. The tissue heats up, swells, becomes tender. That the body working exactly as it should. The problem begins when this system never shuts off. And that is precisely what happens with chronic inflammation. Imagine a fire alarm that rings for years on end, even with no fire at all. The alarm was right the first time, but when it never stops, it becomes the problem itself. That is how chronic inflammation destroys the body from within. It doesn't burn one specific area. It wears everything down. Arteries, joints, neurons, muscles, organs. Physiology researchers have spent decades documenting chronic inflammation as the underlying mechanism behind a vast list of modern conditions. Cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, cognitive decline, obesity, depression, autoimmune disorders. Do you see how everything is connected? These are not separate conditions. They're different expressions of the same silent process. And now comes the question that changes everything. What fuels this alarm that never turns off? The answer lies, in large part, in what you eat. Elite operators learned early a truth that most people only discover too late. Performance is not built on training days. It is destroyed on days of poor eating. A body operating in constant inflammation does not recover well. It does not concentrate clearly. It does not sustain strength. It does not sleep with quality. And no training program, no supplementation, no high-performance strategy works on an inflamed foundation. That is why the nutritional protocol is not supplementary. It is the foundation. And the 14 foods you are about to learn were not chosen by chance. Each one intervenes in a specific, measurable, and proven way in the mechanisms that sustain chronic inflammation. Let's begin. Food 1, beet. Few people look at a beet and think of performance. But they should. Because there is something inside this food that caught the attention of exercise physiology researchers decades ago, and that changed the way some recovery protocols were structured. Beet is one of the densest dietary sources of inorganic nitrates that exist. In other words, when you consume beet, those nitrates are converted in the body into nitric oxide. And nitric oxide does something very specific. It relaxes and dilates blood vessels. Think of it this way. Imagine the circulatory system as a network of hoses. Over time, if those hoses become rigid and narrow, pressure increases, flow drops, and the most distant parts of the system receive less than they need. Nitric oxide acts as a signal that tells the vessel walls, relax. The result is better circulation, lower blood pressure, and, what matters directly to fighting inflammation, a reduction in inflammatory markers in the blood. But beet doesn't stop there. It also contains betalains, the pigments that give it its intense red color. Researchers identified that these betalains have the ability to inhibit certain enzymes involved in inflammatory processes in a way comparable to some pharmacologically studied substances. And there is a detail almost no one mentions. Beet also contains a significant amount of a betalan called betaine, which has demonstrated in laboratory studies the ability to interfere with the activation of NF-κB, a protein considered one of the central switches of the inflammatory cascade in the human body. Practical application. No need to be exotic. Raw grated beet, cooked beet, or concentrated beet juice. Beet juice, in particular, was the most studied format in performance contexts, with intake between 200 and 500 milliliters, approximately 1 to 2 hours before physical activity or as part of recovery protocols. Caution: if you're taking blood pressure medication, the vasodilatory effect of beet may be amplified. Medical supervision is recommended. And yes, urine may turn reddish or pinkish. This is normal. It is the betaine being excreted. It is not a sign of a problem. It is a sign that you ate enough beet. Food 2. Ginger. For more than 2,000 years, populations inhabiting extreme regions of the planet used ginger as a central part of nutritional protocols aimed at maintaining physical vigor under severe conditions. This is not folklore. It is a pattern that modern researchers went on to investigate and found a real pharmacological basis beneath it. Ginger contains bioactive compounds called gingerols and showgales. These compounds act on specific inflammatory pathways. Simply put, they inhibit the production of certain prostaglandins and leukotrienes, messenger molecules the body uses to sustain inflammatory processes. In other words, ginger does not mask inflammation. It interferes with the channels that produce it. Clinical studies examining regular ginger consumption have documented reductions in markers such as C-reactive protein and interleukin-6, two of the most widely used indicators for measuring systemic inflammation in the body. But there is something more that most people don't know about ginger. It also interferes with the COX-2 enzyme. This enzyme is the same one that some pharmaceutical anti-inflammatory drugs were developed to block. The difference is that ginger does so in a gentle, continuous way, without the adverse effects associated with prolonged use of medications in that category. Practical application. Fresh grated ginger in teas, juices, marinades, or soups. The raw root better preserves gingerols. Dried or powdered ginger contains higher concentrations of showgales, which have their own benefit profile. Both forms are valid. 2 to 4 grams per day is the range documented in most studies with consistent effects. Caution: in very high amounts, ginger may have a mild anticoagulant effect. For people taking blood thinners, a conversation with a doctor is necessary. Food 3. Turmeric. If there is one food on this list that has accumulated the most scientific research over the past 3 decades, it is turmeric. And at the same time, it is the food that most people use incorrectly. Turmeric contains a compound called curcumin. And curcumin is, in the world of inflammation research, one of the most intensely studied objects of investigation that exists. The mechanism of action is direct. Curcumin inhibits the activation of NF-κB, the same central switch of the inflammatory cascade mentioned with beet. But it goes further. It also modulates pro-inflammatory cytokines, interferes with COX-2 activity, and has documented antioxidant capacity. In other words, it acts on multiple points of the inflammatory chain simultaneously. Now comes the detail most people completely ignore. Curcumin alone is almost useless. The human body absorbs pure curcumin extremely poorly. It passes through the digestive system before reaching the bloodstream in relevant concentrations. But there is a simple solution that high-performance protocols identified. Piperine, a compound found in black pepper, increases the bioavailability of curcumin by up to 2,000%. This is not an exaggeration. It is the result of pharmacological absorption studies. Adding a small amount of black pepper to turmeric transforms a food with limited effect into one with real systemic action. Practical application. Turmeric powder with black pepper in hot dishes, broths, eggs, smoothies, or plant-based milk. Fat also improves absorption, so consuming it alongside olive oil or another healthy fat source amplifies the effect. Caution. In very high doses as a concentrated supplement, curcumin may interact with anticoagulants and certain liver medications. As a food, in standard culinary amounts, it is widely considered safe. Food 4. Fatty fish, salmon, sardine, mackerel, herring, trout. This is where the inflammation narrative meets one of the most fundamental mechanisms of cellular biology. Fatty fish are the most potent dietary source of long-chain omega-3 of animal origin, specifically EPA and DHA. And what these two compounds do inside the body is something most people have never been told clearly. Every cell in your body is surrounded by a membrane. This membrane is not static. It is dynamic, and its composition determines how the cell responds to the environment around it. When the diet is low in omega-3 and high in omega-6, the profile of most modern diets, cell membranes become, in biochemical terms, more prone to generating pro-inflammatory substances when activated. Long-chain omega-3 alters that composition. It literally changes the material with which the membranes are built, making cells more resistant to uncontrolled inflammation. But there is more. EPA and DHA are precursors of compounds called resolvins and protectins. These compounds don't merely reduce inflammation. They actively signal to the immune system that the inflammatory process can be concluded. In other words, they do not suppress immunity. They help the body complete the inflammatory cycle and return to balance. This is where most people get it wrong. Fighting inflammation is not simply about blocking reactions. It is about restoring the body's capacity to regulate itself. And no food does this more directly than fatty fish. Practical application. 2 to 3 servings per week of wild-caught or traceable fatty fish. Sardines in olive oil, grilled salmon, baked mackerel. These are not sophisticated dishes. They are strategic ones. Caution. Large fish, such as tuna and swordfish, accumulate mercury. Sardines, herring, and mackerel are among the fish with the lowest heavy metal accumulation and the highest omega-3 concentration, a combination that makes them a priority. Food 5. Sweet potato. Sweet potato enters this list not as a carbohydrate substitute. It enters as a food that acts on one of the most overlooked mechanisms when discussing inflammation: the glucose spike. Here is something few people connect clearly. Every time blood sugar rises abruptly and then crashes, the body generates a metabolic stress response. This cycle of repeated spikes and drops over years is one of the primary drivers of low-grade chronic inflammation. Sweet potato has a significantly lower glycemic index than regular potato, especially when consumed boiled with the skin on. But what truly sets sweet potato apart is its nutrient profile. It is one of the richest dietary sources of beta-carotene, the orange pigment the body converts into vitamin A. Beta-carotene is an antioxidant with documented capacity to neutralize reactive oxygen species, the oxidative stress molecules that amplify tissue inflammation. In addition, sweet potato contains anthocyanins, especially in purple flesh varieties, which have demonstrated inhibition of inflammatory markers in multiple studies. Practical application. Boiled, roasted, or mashed, with the skin on whenever possible, as that is where much of the fiber and phytochemicals are concentrated. Combining it with a healthy fat, such as olive oil or butter, improves beta-carotene absorption, since it is fat-soluble. Food 6. Walnuts. There is a reason walnuts appear frequently in longevity studies, and it has nothing to do with protein or quick energy. It has to do with a profile of fatty acids and bioactive compounds that is unique among tree nuts. The walnut is the only nut with a significant amount of ALA, alpha-linolenic acid, the plant-based form of omega-3. ALA is a precursor to EPA and DHA, although conversion in the body is limited. But what sets walnuts apart goes beyond omega-3. Walnuts contain elagitannins, polyphenolic compounds that, when metabolized by the gut microbiota, generate urolithins. And here is something most people have never heard of. Urolithins are substances with documented capacity to modulate intestinal inflammation, which is relevant because the gut is, in many respects, the epicenter of the systemic inflammatory response. A gut with a balanced microbiota and healthy mucosa is a less inflamed gut. And a less inflamed gut means a less inflamed body. Practical application. A handful of walnuts per day, approximately 30 grams, is the range documented in studies with consistent results. Raw or lightly toasted without salt are the forms that best preserve the bioactive compounds. Caution: walnuts are calorie-dense. Integration into the overall dietary pattern should consider the total dietary context. Food 7. Pumpkin seeds. Small, inexpensive, widely overlooked, and, at the same time, one of the most complete nutritional profiles in seed form. Pumpkin seeds enter the anti-inflammatory protocol for multiple reasons. The first is magnesium. Magnesium is involved in more than 300 enzymatic reactions in the human body, including processes directly linked to inflammatory regulation. Population studies consistently show that low magnesium levels are associated with elevated inflammatory markers, such as C-reactive protein. And pumpkin seeds are among the densest dietary sources of magnesium available. The second reason is zinc. Zinc is essential for immune system function, including the regulation of cells that control the inflammatory response. Zinc deficiencies, far more common than most people realize, are associated with dysregulated immune responses and exacerbated inflammation. The third reason is less widely known. Pumpkin seeds contain cucurbitacins, compounds with documented in vivo anti-inflammatory activity, particularly in joint tissue. Practical application: raw or lightly toasted, as a snack or added to salads and soups. 30 grams per day provides a significant fraction of daily magnesium and zinc requirements. Food 8. Mushrooms. Mushrooms occupy a special place on this list, not only because they have direct anti-inflammatory properties, but because they act on a system that lies at the root of much modern chronic inflammation. Adaptive immunity. Mushrooms, especially varieties such as shiitake, maitake, shimeji, and reishi, contain beta-glucans. Beta-glucans are polysaccharides with documented immunomodulatory capacity. This means they do not simply stimulate or suppress the immune system. They help calibrate its response. In other words, with beta-glucans present, the immune system tends to respond in a more precise and less excessive manner. Less excessive response means less unnecessary inflammation. But there is a detail almost no one mentions. Mushrooms are the only significant non-animal dietary source of vitamin D2, especially when exposed to sunlight before consumption. And vitamin D is one of the most potent modulators of the inflammatory response in the body. Vitamin D deficiency, present in a large portion of the population, is consistently associated with elevated systemic inflammation. Practical application: mushrooms sautéed in olive oil or butter as the base of dishes, soups, or warm salads. Heat is necessary to break down the cell walls and release the bioactive compounds. To boost vitamin D, leave the mushrooms exposed to sunlight, with the gills facing up, for 15 to 20 minutes before cooking. Food 9. Pineapple. Pineapple is on this list because of one enzyme. Just one, but it is enough to justify the presence of this food in any anti-inflammatory recovery protocol. That enzyme is bromelain. Bromelain is a protease, an enzyme that breaks down proteins. And what it does in the context of inflammation is something researchers took decades to fully understand. Bromelain interferes with the activation of pro-inflammatory cells. It modulates the production of certain cytokines, and it has demonstrated in studies the capacity to reduce swelling and pain in acute inflammatory processes. In practice, it has been studied in contexts such as post-surgical recovery, muscle injuries, and inflammatory joint conditions, with results that led to the creation of supplements based on bromelain extracts. But there is a detail. The highest concentration of bromelain is found in the core of the pineapple, the central, more fibrous part that most people discard. Practical application. Fresh pineapple in moderate portions, including the central core when possible. Canned pineapple in syrup loses most of its active bromelain due to the industrial heating process. Caution. Pineapple contains fructose and natural sugars. People managing blood sugar levels should moderate consumption and avoid eating it in large amounts on its own. Food 10. Cinnamon. Cinnamon is a perfect example of a food that most people completely underestimate. Not because they don't know cinnamon, but because they don't know what it does inside the body. The central bioactive compound in cinnamon, especially the Ceylon variety, is called cinnamaldehyde. Cinnamaldehyde has demonstrated the capacity to inhibit the production of certain inflammatory cytokines and to interfere with the activation of NF-κB. But what makes cinnamon truly strategic in the anti-inflammatory context is its effect on insulin sensitivity. Studies have documented that regular cinnamon consumption improves the cellular response to insulin, allowing the body to process glucose more efficiently. Why does this matter? Because insulin resistance, the condition in which cells stop responding adequately to insulin signal, is one of the most powerful drivers of low-grade chronic inflammation. A body that cannot process glucose well lives in a metabolic state that continuously fuels inflammation. Cinnamon acts at the root of that problem. Practical application. Ceylon cinnamon, not cassia cinnamon, which contains coumarin in concentrations that may be problematic with daily use. Ceylon cinnamon has a more delicate texture, a milder flavor, and a superior safety profile for continuous consumption. Half to 1 teaspoon per day in coffee, teas, smoothies, or yogurt is already sufficient for the documented effects. Food 11. Kefir and natural yogurt. This is the moment where the narrative needs to enter a territory that most inflammation documentaries ignore entirely. The gut, not as a digestive organ, as a defense system. Approximately 70% of the body's immune cells are located in the tissue associated with the gut. This is not a metaphor. It is functional anatomy. What happens inside the gut, the composition of the microbiota, the integrity of the mucosa, the balance between beneficial and pathogenic bacteria, largely determines the level of inflammatory activity throughout the entire body. When the microbiota is out of balance, a condition called dysbiosis, the gut can become permeable, allowing substances that should remain confined to the digestive tract to enter the bloodstream. This activates the immune system, and systemic inflammation follows. Kefir and naturally fermented yogurt are sources of probiotic bacteria, living organisms that, when consumed in sufficient quantities, colonize the gut and help restore microbiota balance. Kefir, in particular, has a more diverse bacterial strain profile than most commercial yogurts. And intestinal microbial diversity is, according to microbiome researchers, one of the most reliable indicators of systemic health. Practical application. Milk kefir or water kefir fermented with active cultures. Plain whole milk yogurt with no added sugar or flavoring. The phrase contains live lactobacilli on the label does not guarantee efficacy. Seek artisan-made products or yogurts with documented real fermentation. Caution. For people with severe lactose intolerance, milk kefir can be replaced by water kefir, which has a different but equally relevant probiotic profile. Food 12. Cherries, especially tart cherry. If there is one food on this list that surprises people most when the research is presented, it is tart cherry, especially in the context of muscle recovery and post-exertion inflammatory regulation. Tart cherry, also known as Montmorency cherry, contains an exceptional concentration of anthocyanins. Anthocyanins are pigments belonging to the flavonoid family with well-documented antioxidant and anti-inflammatory capacity. But what brought tart cherry into recovery protocols was something more specific. Clinical studies with athletes demonstrated that consumption of concentrated tart cherry juice in the 48 hours before and after intense activity significantly reduced markers of muscle damage and post-exercise inflammation, while also accelerating strength recovery. This caught the attention of physiology researchers. But there is an additional dimension that few mention. Tart cherry is one of the few dietary sources of melatonin, and melatonin, beyond regulating sleep, has direct antioxidant and anti-inflammatory activity. Poor sleep and chronic inflammation feed each other. A food that acts on both fronts at once is strategically valuable. Practical application. Fresh tart cherries when available. Unvitene dry tart cherries, or concentrated Montmorency cherry juice, at a quantity of 30 to 60 milliliters of concentrate diluted in water. Food 13. Green tea. Green tea is one of the most studied foods on the planet, and at the same time, one of the most misused. The central compound of interest in green tea is EGCG, epigallocatechin gallate. EGCG is the most abundant and most potent catechin found in green tea, and it has a profile of biological activity that goes far beyond the basic antioxidant most people imagine. EGCG has demonstrated the capacity to inhibit the activation of NF-κB, reduce the production of pro-inflammatory cytokines, interfere with the activity of enzymes involved in inflammatory processes, modulate cellular signaling pathways associated with accelerated aging. In other words, green tea does not act on a single point of the inflammatory cascade. It acts on multiple points simultaneously. There's also a relevant cognitive dimension. Green tea contains L-theanine, an amino acid that acts in synergy with the caffeine present in the tea. Unlike pure coffee, where caffeine generates peaks of activation followed by a crash, L-theanine smooths this cycle, producing a state of calm, sustained alertness. Operators who need sustained attention without the rebound effects of concentrated caffeine know this difference well. Practical application. Loose-leaf green tea, not low-quality tea bags. Water temperature, between 70 and 80 degrees Celsius. Boiling water destroys part of the catechins. 2 to 3 cups per day is the range with the greatest support in the literature. Caution: green tea contains caffeine. Sensitive individuals, or those who consume it in the evening, should consider decaffeinated versions or limit consumption to the morning hours. Food 14. Dark chocolate, 70% cocoa or more. This is the last food on the list, and it is possibly the one that will surprise you most. Not because chocolate is a secret, but because what happens inside the body when you consume truly concentrated cocoa is something most people never knew. High-concentration cocoa, 70% or more, contains flavonoids called flavonols. And cocoa flavonols have demonstrated in research something remarkable. They improve endothelial function. The endothelium is the layer of cells lining the inside of blood vessels. When the endothelium is inflamed and dysfunctional, vessels become rigid, circulation worsens, and cardiovascular risk increases. Cocoa flavonols stimulate nitric oxide production in the endothelium, the same mechanism we saw with beet, and reduce markers of vascular inflammation. But there is more. Researchers documented that regular consumption of flavonol-rich cocoa is associated with improvements in cognitive markers, cerebral blood flow, sustained attention, working memory. And there is still a dimension of cocoa that is rarely mentioned. It contains magnesium, the same mineral we saw in pumpkin seeds, along with compounds that positively modulate the central nervous system in ways researchers are still mapping. Practical application. Dark chocolate with 70% cocoa or more. 1 to 2 servings of 20 to 30 grams per day. The higher the cocoa percentage, the lower the added sugar, and the higher the concentration of flavonols. Varieties with 85%, 90%, or 100% cocoa are progressively richer in bioactive compounds and progressively lower in sugar. Caution: milk chocolate or low cocoa chocolate does not offer the same profile. Milk, in particular, may interfere with flavonol absorption when combined with cocoa. You may be thinking, do I need to consume all 14 every single day? No, That is not the point. The point is to understand that each of these foods acts on a different aspect of the inflammatory system. Some act on the production of inflammatory molecules. Others act on intestinal absorption and the microbiota. Others act on circulation and vascular health. Others act on the nervous system and muscle recovery. When you begin integrating multiple of these foods throughout the week, you're not merely adding nutrients. You are building a network of inflammatory modulation. And that is exactly what long-duration performance protocols understood before most people did. No food, however powerful, acts in isolation. It is the pattern that determines the outcome. One day of salmon resolves nothing. But salmon twice a week, along with daily walnuts, cinnamon in your morning coffee, turmeric with pepper at lunch, green tea in the afternoon, and dark chocolate in the evening, over weeks and months, builds a completely different metabolic environment. And it is in that different environment that chronic inflammation begins to retreat. How many of these signals is your body already sending? The fatigue that seems to have no cause. The pain that appears for no reason. The weight that resists. The mental fog that compromises clarity. These are not signs of age. They're signals from a system asking to be recalibrated. And recalibration begins at the next meal. The body rarely fails suddenly. It whispers for years before it starts to scream. And the cruelest thing about chronic inflammation is exactly that. It does not scream. It murmurs. It erodes. It subtracts little by little. The strength that gradually diminishes. The memory that slowly fades. The sleep that progressively loses quality. The recovery that takes longer and longer. All of this has a common root. And the common root has a simple, accessible, and powerful answer. Not in a pill. Not in an extraordinary training protocol. In your next grocery run. In what you put on your plate. In the small, continuous decision to nourish the body the way it was designed to be nourished. Long-term performance experts do not eat this way because they are excessively disciplined. They eat this way because they understood something most people still do not know. Longevity is not won on difficult days. It is built on ordinary days, in the foods of every Monday, in the tea of every afternoon, in the choice that seems too small to matter, but which, added to thousands of other equal choices, completely redefines what your body is capable of becoming in the decades ahead. The secret was never hidden. It was simply ignored. Now I want to hear from you. Of these 14 foods, which one will you put into practice first? Choose one, just one, and write the word ready in the comments. Because perhaps that is exactly the message someone else needed to find today. Someone who is exhausted without knowing why. Someone who is looking for a simple answer in a world full of complicated information. Share this video with that person. Sometimes, the smallest gesture is what changes the course of someone's life.